get to share a little bit about my trips to Panama with y'all today. I'm going to be focusing primarily on the 2 trips that I took, as well as briefly talking about some of the prior trips that the Gulf Coast professional chapter has taken. So how I got involved with EWV, when I first transitioned from Mississippi State from Southwest Community College, where I've been playing softball, I did not want to get involved in any extracurriculars, no groups or anything. So I kind of stayed away from EWV and all that. But when I started a co-op in the fall of 2018, my mentor there was really trying to get me involved because he was going to the monthly meetings down there on the coast. So eventually I agreed to attend, and after that I could not stop thinking about how much I wanted to travel with them on some of their upcoming trips that they had. And so that was in November, and then by December I had my passport and then was planning on traveling for spring break in March. But before this I had never really been much of a traveler. The most I had done was going to Texas to visit some of my family, or I had gone to Disney World or Nashville to go hiking some waterfalls the previous spring break. So chapter had selected this project in Panama based on available projects EWB had on their website. The community had Peace Corps volunteers who had requested the project previously. There were other groups who had shown interest in the project that they were having. They would come, do a survey, and leave and never come back. So a little bit about the community of Boca de Curia. It was founded in the 1970s by Isabel. Since then, the population has grown to nearly 250 people, including 50 families. They get their money by subsistence farming of crops such as rice, corn, yucca root, and they also raise cattle, chickens, and pigs also in their village. They also weave Panama hats that they sell in Panama. And within the community, they have established an elementary, an upper elementary school, a church, and a general store. And so here you can see an image of the bridge committee there in the village. So kind of in the center in the light blue shirt is Isabel, and he actually donated some of his farmland so that the bridge project could get underway. But it was beneficial to have all the communities from the surrounding area working on it together, so we had more people for labor. So here is, I just highlighted like where Boca de Curia is from Jackson. Most of us would fly out of New Orleans on Copa Airlines and get there on a direct flight at probably 10 a.m. Some of the other travelers had gone through Houston and Miami, but they had up to 10-hour delays in the airport. Once we were in Panama City, we would either spend a couple days either at the beginning of the trip or at the end of the trip, just kind of soaking in some of their culture, walking around their capital and the old capital that they have, sightseeing and window shopping. The closest established city to Boca de Curia is Panama, and this is where we would go get our supplies and materials that we needed to bring into the village. So they had kind of like a Home Depot, they had a Trillia, and so we'd go there prior to going to the village. But you needed to give several days' notice due to the conditions of the road and the distance that would be to travel, because it would take their delivery people a good bit or half the day at least to make it there and back. So during the first trip, we went on in 2019. We did not stay in the village. We stayed kind of in between Panama and the village at the Hotel Finca Ely. It takes just a little over an hour to drive this 27-kilometer trip from here into the village. It really wasn't all that far, but what took so long was that the road was going up and down a mountain. It was also made of real like gravel material, and so you wanted to drive real slow just in case you had a carload, so you weren't bouncing like all over the place and making a really uncomfortable drive. But also going into the village, you had to cross some smaller rivers that you can see here, and so we really tried to have four-wheel drive vehicles that we would rent from the airport to get to the village. So during the assessment trips, they took a survey of the cross-section of the river to determine the profile of the site. This gave us some indication of the water depth we're witnessing during the dry season. They had the elders of the village kind of mark out where they had noticed high water elevations during the wet season. And so in order for us to determine where we were going to place our bridge along the river, we wanted to be sure that we weren't going to be in that flood hazard area as well. And we didn't really have any information really to go off of for elevations. And so they set a bench marker out by a tree, just a piece of rebar, and encased it in concrete. And so that was arbitrary in how we compared elevations. So this is a photo of the chosen bridge site. It is facing the Tule River towards the village, and it was chosen because it had a pre-existing access road so that people can get to other neighboring communities as well as back into Panama. So as you can see here, this is the main way that they would cross over during the dry season. They would either walk across or even ride up on horseback. And so during the dry season, they were able to do this, but once the rain season came in May through December, the water levels would rise at least 10 feet. And so this would cut off the neighboring communities from the education, healthcare, and trade that was on the village side of the river. So the bridge type that they originally wanted to do was a suspended bridge, as it would have been cheaper, but the existing grades would not allow for that. So they followed in Bridges to Prosperity's design and construction guidelines. And some of the chapter members also attended some of the B2P seminars in Indiana, I believe, and decided that a suspension bridge would be beneficial for this project. This is kind of an example of one that B2P had done actually in Panama on the way to our village site. And this is probably about, I would assume, 3 times the size that we did of our bridge. So in 2016, the members of the Mississippi Gulf Coast Professionals chapter of BWB went and had their initial visits, met with the bridge committee and some of the local officials. The designs were approved in 2017, and construction phase of the project began in 2018. Since then, 10 teams have traveled between 2018 and 2020 and completed tasks such as excavation, pouring concrete foundations, constructing the towers to ship to the country, completing the ramps, and lifting towers, pulling cables, and the decking. So these are a few images from trips prior to mine, showing the excavation, foundation, pedestal construction. Here you can see some of the villagers were working to excavate for the pedestals, but you can also kind of see in the background how much forestry that they had. And so a lot of these trees had to be cut down because they were going to be in the way of our bridge and possibly fall and risk the integrity of it. So because the community is in such an isolated area, there's obviously no concrete batch plants available. And so the concrete had to be mixed on site, but this was all determined on if we had the materials readily available, like if we can get them delivered, like because we had that small window of January to April that trucks could actually get back to the village would determine whether or not we could continue building for the next trip that would come down. And here they are just kind of doing some finishing on the foundation. So in March of 2019, I took my first trip down there. I went with Mr. Mitchell, Daniel Powell, and my mom, who is actually fluent in Spanish. And so she actually really enjoyed getting to go on the trip because she grew up in Venezuela, but it was really beneficial having her there as a translator, as well as Colin, who was the Peace Corps volunteer at the time. So without them, we weren't going to be able to communicate thoroughly and describe to the villagers how and what construction processes needed to be done. So during that time, we would gather materials for continuation construction because we needed more concrete materials for them to pour the anchor beams for the next group. But really, while we were there, we were assuring that the alignment between the anchor beam and the pedestals were going to be right. And so we had a level and we shot across the river. You could see we had kind of a center point marked out on each side between the pedestals. And so we wanted to ensure that there was a 180-degree angle between where we were setting our anchor beam stakes and our center lines. And so that was kind of how we spent the majority of this trip, is just ensuring the alignment was right. We weren't able to have like heavy machinery on site, and so when we went to go form the transition arms, we needed to make shepherd's hooks, but the only thing we could bring into country to bend the hooks were this rebar bender. But we should have practiced a little bit beforehand because we didn't realize quite how tough it would be. But here you can see Daniel and one of the villagers try to bend it at the correct dimensions for the hooks that we needed. So in March of 2020, I went on my second trip along with Adam Dial, Robert Smith, and 8 other Mississippi State Gulf Coast students. Colin's time as a Peace Corps volunteer had ended, so thankfully one of the students was fluent in Spanish and was able to translate for us. We ultimately split into 2 groups. One was going to be building swing sets for the bridge, and the one other was going to be erecting the scaffolding and the tower. I just wanted to do a brief kind of introduction for everybody. Seen here, you can see Alex in the short sleeve navy. He was our interpreter, and here is one of the times where he would interpret between one of the villagers and Adam when the towers had been delivered. And so he was kind of needed all over the site, like 24/7, just because none of us could really communicate very well. On the left is Grant. He spent his spring break doing some calculus to determine the spacing that was going to be in between the swing sets on the support cable. And he also was on the swing set team. Alora on the right was kind of a great leader for the swing set team. She was really organized, but what made her really beneficial was she wasn't fluent in Spanish, but over time she could remember some of the key words and phrases so that we weren't having to call over Alex, and like we could still continue our construction process of building those, and so the other group can continue theirs as well. On the left is Nate and Caleb, and they were really in charge of scaffolding in the towers team. And on the edges on the right, we have Terrell and Cameron, and they were our safety leaders because with so many people doing different tasks and everything, and there were kids around the site with all these tools and heavy equipment that we really needed more than just one person looking out. So we try to have one person kind of on each side of the river, ensuring that there was safety being taken. So this is where we would sleep. We set up our hammocks underneath this guest house that they had built for us. Some on the first night had actually put their hammocks in the tree line, but a quick, brief, heavy rainstorm deterred them from remaining out there, as well as some of the chickens that were free roaming. Something that I think that was really beneficial prior to us actually going into the village, we stopped at that bridge I mentioned earlier to kind of talk through and really think about like what we were going to be doing. As we were still students, not many of us had experience on a construction site, and so it was really good to kind of see and learn before we just dove right in and got to work. But it's also beneficial because a lot of them are not civil engineers, but their focus on studies is mechanical industrial, so it's kind of different for them as well. So for the swing set team, we built this mold out of a plank and some rebar, and so we used a pipe to bend the rebar around these stubs. And so we had to make 96 of these, 24 groups of 4 for each length that we needed. And to ensure that each group was precise in their measurements, we had to be real careful, just because we were having different people do it every couple hours. And we were at first having some real inconsistency with the lengths that we were getting. But by the end of the first day, we had about 8 groups done, I would say. So the second day, Alora and I really worked on creating a better system that would speed up the process, but still ensure accurate measurements. And so with the team, we were able to actually put our system into play. And so it took a good community and a couple hours to get going, but once we did, we knocked the rest of the groups out that day, surprisingly, and I thought we were going to need a whole other day to complete them. But like I said, it was beneficial to have her because she would pick up the key phrases in Spanish. So on Tuesday, I believe, Alex and Adam had gone back into Panama to get the towers from the government storage facility. We had them and the cables shipped from the United States, thinking it would be more cost efficient. Um, they had delivered the cables, however, the towers were a bit tricky to get out. And so they were trying to go get that so we can continue with our construction process. But that same day, the rest of us realized we didn't bring enough water into the village with us. And so after that work day, we went ahead and went back into the community of Panama and met up with them, and we're going to help them bring back the towers. And so finally, Wednesday afternoon, we were able to get the towers delivered to the site. And I'm telling you, the whole community came out because they were so excited to actually kind of see the process getting vertical. They had done all this earthwork in preparation, but they could see that it was getting near completion. In order to lift the towers in place, we got this pulley system involving some of the nearby trees in the truck. I think one of my favorite memories of it was everyone was on one side, but everyone was on the other side bank rather than where the truck was, and they needed it pushed a little bit further. And so I had just actually learned how to drive stick shift. So as one of the few that was on the side with the truck, I jumped in and was able to move it just enough before I stalled out. Here they were attaching the main cables to the towers. Like I said, they had already been delivered prior to the towers. They had to wade across the river after they strung them over the top to get it to the other side and connect to the anchor beam with some U-bolts. So we were originally going to be leaving, I think it was Friday or Saturday. And so we had already left for the day, but a couple of them were able to come back because they realized that they had canceled school for the week after spring break. So a couple of them stayed a few extra days and they were able to keep working on the decking and the safety fence. I just wanted to throw this in because prior to that, when we were instead of the main cables, I was wading across with the support cables for the swing sets, and so I just thought this was neat to show that this is during the dry season. So I'm about 5'5", and the water elevation was already up kind of towards my chest, and so just during the wet season, it would be well above my head, and they would not be able to kind of get across as easily as I did. But they were also like wondering why they sent the girl into the river, and so they tried to get some of the guys to help out. Some of the best times was spent just hanging out with the kids in the community. This was one of the days that they were still erecting the towers, so our swing set group got to take a break and just really enjoy hanging out with them. What was neat was a couple of us volunteers had Google Translate on their phones, and so we were able to find a way to communicate with them. This actually is one of my favorite photos from the trip. This shows Isabel, the community leader, and one of the mentors that went on the trip, kind of walking side by side across the nearly completed bridge. I just thought that was just a great, like, we're almost done with this project. And this is actually our mostly completed bridge. As you can see, they had all the decking and the safety fence up. They just had some equipment that they still needed to clean up. They had also chopped down some of those trees, and so they needed to get rid of those still so that it wouldn't cause flooding issues in the future. And this kind of just shows the entire community. that was helping with the labor and some of the kids and as volunteers. This was prior to completion of the bridge. Some of the lessons that I think we learned throughout the process of this project is that everything takes longer than you think. Deliveries won't always be on time. To ensure that you have enough time in advance for traveling and communicate well with the other groups that had been on prior trips before yours and after yours, so you know like what progress has been made and what issues you may have had, and how you can improve based on those. Sometimes, even though you're doing this for them, you need to beg or bribe them to get some of them working. But it does keep in mind you are taking them from their other work. But I figured since we're building them a bridge, they would want to get this done. Another thing is that teamwork is essential. Times can get tough when you're in a village and kind of away from your norm, but not to let the villagers see the volunteers like bickering. Just find a productive way to talk through if you have some kind of issue. Ensure you at least have one or two people who can act as translators while you're down there. Um, Otherwise, it's just a real pain to try to use your phone, because the first year I put Google Translate on my phone, but I didn't have any service down there, so it really wasn't beneficial. And also, don't ship from the U.S., because even though we thought we were saving on some costs, it turns out it was the same, if not more. And so, as I mentioned earlier, some of the things that we enjoyed after a long day of working was getting to hang out with the kids. Here we had purchased these tubes for the delivery truck, just in case while crossing some of those small river crossings that they might get stuck. But thankfully they didn't, but the kids really enjoyed them as toys. And so I actually have a video that you can see them playing. So I thought that was pretty just fun getting to hear the joy and just playing with simple things like a tube. Um, Also, some things that we would do after like a long hot day of working was we would swim in the river with them. Uh, and this was in kind of one of the shallower areas where we had cut down some of the trees. But they would jump in just so fearlessly, and it was just really fun getting to play with them. So here is just it's fun comparing like how we were as Americans crossing the river compared to how the natives were. So we were always slow, being real cautious in our steps on where we would put them. But however, most of us would still end up falling in the river, getting our shoes and pants wet and everything. But the kids and villagers either had boots or they would just go across barefoot. It was so quick and fluid and like without hesitation. And so they would always laugh at us when we would fall. But we would we would actually send them across with some of the smaller tools or something that we needed just because they could get across so much faster than we could. And so we did take with us some frisbees, some baseball equipment, some soccer balls, and played with them as well after a long day of work. So they loved playing soccer. And most days they would beat uh, us in a game of soccer. Are there any questions that y'all might have? If not, that's all I had. But
I was going to say, if you have questions for Kelsey, You can unmute yourself on the side and ask them, or you can type them into the chat box.
So how did COVID impact the villagers at the time and their travel plans? So we weren't expecting to have as many kids kind of on the job site as we did, but their schools had also been starting to get canceled, so they were around a lot more, and it was kind of hard trying to keep them off some of the scaffolding because we didn't want them to fall and get hurt. And then, so as I mentioned earlier, a couple of us were coming back on that Friday or Saturday, but some were able to stay in the country because school had been canceled because of COVID. Traveling back, it was really, a lot of people were more cautious. And they were also, the New Orleans airport was really empty when we got back, and so was the Miami. And they had already set up some screening using monitors instead of people. They really wanted you to wear masks and all, but I think the main thing was that the kids were uh, on site and we weren't really prepared for that. So I want to say that we designed it for at least 10 years, but I wasn't involved with the chapter at this time. And so I'm not 100% sure. The bridge committee, I would assume, would be responsible for repairs. But we haven't closed out on the project yet. And so we still have, I think, a year to go down there and finalize some of who would be responsible and things like that for the project. We actually have a website that and a Facebook page for the Mississippi Gulf Coast Professionals chapter. As of now, they are currently trying to merge with the Mississippi State University Gulf Coast campus chapter they're forming, because that's kind of who all went on this past trip and they will want to get involved. But because they are a satellite campus from the main, the EWB wasn't kind of recognizing them as separate from the main campus. So they're planning on merging here in the near future. I am kind of, however, like in the future, hoping that the Jackson area will establish their own EWB chapter in the near future, because that'd be something I'd be really interested in getting involved in, just because they'd be closer to here, and I could be more actively involved than I could be if I was still a member on the Gulf Coast chapter. Are there any other questions?
I guess if we don't have any other questions, we'll get wrapped up. Just remember, if you know of anyone interested in being the younger member chair for the Jackson branch of ASCE, please reach out to me at hannah.denson@greshamsmith.com. And if you have any other questions about EWB or how to get involved, we can get you in. Please feel free to reach out and we can get you guys in touch with Kelsey. And thanks for listening in.
All right. Thank y'all.